William the Conqueror. Born sometime during the year 1028 AD, William was the son of Robert, Duke of Normandy. Early in his life, he was known as William the Bastard. To our modern minds, this would mean he was born out of wedlock, but by the meaning of the term during William's life, it could just as easily mean he was born to a lower class woman. This does seem a bit less likely, though, as his mother would go on to marry a Norman noble and have more children with him. When William was around the age of 7, his father left on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and died on his way home, leaving William as Duke at the age of 8. In truth, as with most cases of a child ruler, this meant trouble in Normandy and a general loss of power by the Duke. There were attempts to kidnap the young boy and, if possible, remove him from his place of power. William had more than one guardian killed, and some are said to have been killed right in front of him. The study of William's childhood is hard because there is little in most stories that can be proven or disproven. However, one thing we can be sure of is that William learned how to fight while growing up, and he learned how to fight very well. Some would claim in his own lifetime that he was the best knight in all of Europe. And while this claim does smack of exaggeration, it cannot be dismissed outright. Growing up a warrior would be very important for Duke William because basically from the moment he assumed power till some point in the 1060s, he would be at war with rebels in his own lands. In 1047, William would win the Battle of Valsduns. This would be his first major victory versus the rebels. And William won this battle in large part due to the aid of King Henry I of France, who was not willing to let this new ruler fall to rebels without a fight. The Battle of Valsduns would mark a turning point as William began to retake his realm from the rebels. Fighting would continue for most of his reign, but William would manage to take full control of his realm back by 1060, when he would start to float a new idea: taking the crown of England. However, before we go there, we should consider William's family. His father, as was already stated, was a Duke of Normandy, and his mother was a commoner who married a Norman vassal. From this marriage, William would gain 2 half-brothers. The elder of these was Robert, who would become a count. The younger and better known of the brothers was Odo, who would become Bishop of Bayeux at the age of 20. In the 1050s, William would marry his wife, Matilda of Flanders. At the time, it would put him in a bad spot with the Pope in Rome, as he had forbidden the marriage due to closeness of blood. While this would be worked out in the end, likely due to a large payment of money, for now William had his wife, and with her he would have 9 kids. 4 of these would be boys. It seems to have been an uncommonly good match for once. Weddings between nobles and even royals would be at best a working relationship, and at worst mutual attempts to murder each other back in those days. However, in this case, it seems that William and Matilda truly came to love each other. At the very least, there are no signs that history can find of cheating by either party. Sometime during 1060, William had his eldest son recognized as heir to the Duchy of Normandy. This, in many ways, was the first sign that William had something big, and rather more dangerous than normal, planned. William's own father recognized him as heir before he left for the Holy Land. However, in William's case, it was not a pilgrimage he was planning, but rather an invasion. England had issues with her kings leading up to this point, and during the mid-1060s they would come to a head. The king, whose name was Edward, had no kids, and it was becoming clear would have no kids from this point on. William, who was a distant cousin, claimed that Edward had promised him the throne should Edward die without heirs. This point is often debated. Edward had reason to look with favor on his Norman relations, as when he was exiled for a time from his homeland, it was the Norman dukes who took him in. Unfortunately for William, whether this claim was true or not, the crown of England was not in the gift of her kings. While a king could nominate a successor, it was down to a council of nobles and bishops to recognize the new king. While it was not a democracy by any means, it did give the nobles of England more say in their rulers than most peoples enjoyed. For William, though, this would mean war. You see, William had contenders to the throne. He was neither the closest in blood ties, as Edward had a child nephew from a half-brother, nor was William on the spot when the old king died. And thus we come to Harold Godwinson. Harold was the son of the old Earl of Wessex, who was the most powerful landowner in the kingdom next to the king. Godwin would have several sons, all of whom would rise to the rank of Earl, the English word for count more or less at this point in time. Harold would become the oldest to survive his father and would inherit the earldom of Wessex from his father. This, combined with his own land holdings, would put him in an almost equal level with the king himself. Harold, by the 1060s, had become the right-hand man of the king and was, in many ways, even more powerful than the king himself. As such, Harold, who was at the old king's deathbed and was said to have received his blessing, was the natural choice for king. He was the old king's brother-in-law through marriage. His brothers and himself controlled more than half of England, and most of all, he was a grown, battle-tested man. Edward's nephew might have been the closest by blood, yet few would have liked to have seen him come to the throne as a child. One would have to look no farther than William in Normandy to see how a child king would hurt a land. On January 6, 1066, Harold was elected king by the nobles of England. William was rather upset by this, and while he waited for winter to end, he began working on an invasion plan. William would manage to get the Pope's approval by claiming that his invasion of England was to reform the church there. With the backing of the Pope, William's invasion gained massive support, and from there he was ready to invade England by June 1066. However, William would be trapped in harbor while contrary winds blew. This would prove a blessing for William, though he cursed it at the time. Had William invaded during the summer, he would have found an English fleet waiting for him off the coast. However, by early September, Harold had to disband both the fleet and the army he had waiting for William. But 2 days after Harold left the coast to return to London, William's fleet set sail. Unfortunately for him, a storm would force him back into port for about 2 weeks. On September 27th, William, Duke of Normandy, and a man who dared to claim a crown, set sail for England. On the morning of the 28th, William would find his boat all alone. He is reported to have sat down to breakfast while waiting to learn what happened to his fleet. As it turned out, he had merely outrun them, and that day he landed on the south coast of England. And there he found nothing. Not a soldier was there to fight him. You see, just after Harold got to London, he learned that another claimant to the English throne had landed in the north with a huge Viking army. Harold rallied an army and marched north at top speed. There he managed to beat the Vikings and kill the claimant in pitched battle. While he was celebrating this victory, he learned that William had landed. William landed without a fight. He immediately began to fortify his landing position. From there he began to raid the countryside, taking what food they needed and burning the rest. The area he landed in was the heartland of Harold's power before he became king, and this might explain what was about to happen. Harold, having raced south with his army, now prepared for battle. It has often been wondered why he would do that, why he would stake his whole claim to the crown and the future of Saxon England on a single battle, and why, having decided to do so, he did not wait for his full strength to gather. It's estimated that Harold could have had as many as 40,000 troops to go to battle with William had he waited at least 2 weeks. Had he had this many troops, it's hard to see what the Duke could have done. So why? Why not wait? Why fight so soon? Well, there are a few reasons that could have been why. The land William was plundering since he landed was Harold's old earldom, and he likely felt as though this was a personal attack on himself. Moreover, William had claimed since the start that Harold was both usurper and oath-breaker, and upon landing he sent a personal message accusing him of such. Harold, being a rather proud man, may have been stung by it. He also may have wanted to disprove the claim of being a usurper by pitched battle. A win versus William would have cemented his claim and ended any question of legitimacy. But perhaps the biggest reason for Harold going into battle was his own confidence. He had beaten the northern invasion with a pitched battle, and maybe felt like there was no way he could lose. Whatever the reason for his decision, the consequences would be earth-shaking. The Battle of Hastings is every bit as important as has ever been reported. Victory for William would change the course of English politics on the mainland. While the Saxons had barely any interest in Europe south of Scandinavia, the Norman dukes had clear invested interests in northern France and would often be involved in fighting with the French crown. Without Hastings, English kings likely never come to hold a claim to the French crown, a claim that would last till the days of Elizabeth I. All that would have to wait, though. William had a battle to win. In terms of arms and armor, there would be no huge difference. The Saxons were armed with the same weapons they had used for generations. Axes and massive round shields for the more heavily armored troops. Spears and smaller and weaker shields for the lightly armored troops. The Normans used more traditional weapons such as swords, maces, and lances. The biggest difference in the armies would have been cavalry. The mounted knight was just coming into fashion in France, and William had a large number of them. Meanwhile, the mounted fighter was all but unknown to the Saxons. There have been claims that the Normans had a large number of archers, while the Saxons had none at all, but these claims seem a bit far-fetched. The claims that they won the battle for William single-handed are also ridiculous. He would use them to great effect at the end of the battle, but besides that, they seemed to have very little impact on the course of the battle. The battle was, from the start, between the most heavily armored Saxon troops, known as Huscarls, and the Norman knights. The Saxons took up a defensive line at the top of a hill where they linked their shields side by side in traditional formation. Harold intended to hold the line at the top of the hill and simply let the Normans waste their army attacking his troops while they had the advantage. The Norman cavalry came storming up the hill in rank upon rank to attack the Saxon line, and they were beaten off time and time again. By mid-morning, there was no advantage on either side. However, that all changed when the left flank of William's army began to retreat in such confusion that the Saxon troops believed them to be routed. The Saxon troops broke ranks and charged down the hill after them. Harold managed to gain control of most of his army, but a large number of the lightly armored troops had chased so far that they were surrounded. It is from this confusion that the famous story of William throwing off his helmet to show his face and prove that, contrary to rumor, he was very much not dead, comes from. There is some debate as to whether or not this story is true. It is, however, recorded in most of the historical accounts of the battle, and therefore mostly accepted as truth. Even if it was not as dramatic as the story tells, it does seem that William did rally his troops. Had Harold struck when William's army was in such confusion, there is a good chance of Harold winning the battle there and then. Harold, however, in this moment proved to be a careful man, and that carefulness would cost him his life. William did not win the battle in this moment, but the tide was slowly turning. Harold's troops were worn out, and what was more, his heavily armored troops were being worn down. Whereas they started the day as his front ranks, by mid-afternoon, many of the lightly armored troops had been forced to take the place of the fallen. And this was where William would gain his edge. Towards the end of the day, the Normans began sending what their historians claim were staged retreats, trying to tempt the lightly armored and lightly trained troops out of the shield wall. As this began to work, gaps opened in the shield wall, and now William sent his archers into close range. From there, they began to wreak havoc among the Saxons. After 6 hours of fighting, the Saxon line finally began to break. And at that moment, Harold, the last Saxon king, looked up and was struck in the eye by a falling arrow. With his death, the battle was over. The Saxons began an all-out retreat. William had won the battle, but the cost had been extremely heavy. He had lost at least a quarter of his army. Had the Saxons had a king or great noble to rally under, they might have been able to put an army into the field that could drive the Normans out. But Harold and his 2 remaining brothers had fallen at Hastings. Those of the nobles that were left after Hastings took a few indecisive steps before offering the crown of England to William. At last, William had a kingdom. In a mix of Saxon and French customs, William would be crowned King of England. Maybe this was what changed his title. In most history books, after the Battle of Hastings, William's title would change, from the Bastard to the Conqueror. William was the crowned king, but not everyone would bow before him. He would face many rebellions, but none would come close to overthrowing him till 1069. 3 years after landing in England, William would face the combined might of the last Saxon claimant to the throne, Edgar the Atheling, supported by King Malcolm I of Scotland and the Danish king Sweyn. When a Danish fleet landed in the north of England, the city of York and much of the country around would join the Danes. William would cross from Normandy to England with a large army of mercenaries. He would pay the Danish king to abandon England with his fleet. From there, William would then march through the north of England, burning and massacring as he went. He came to the town of York and decided to make an example of it. He would burn York to the ground, and would then celebrate the Christmas holiday in the ruins of the smoking city. The story goes that he would call for his throne and crown, and would sit down wearing it in the middle of the burned city. This would be more or less the end of rebellions in England. At least, rebellions with any chance of overthrowing William. William's legacy in the north, however, was one of blood and ash. Many of the fields were so destroyed they would not grow crops again for generations to come. And many more people would die from a lack of food than ever died from the sword. At this point, the biggest threat to William was now the King of France, who would incite William's eldest son into rebellion. At the end of 1086, William would travel to France to put down a rebellion in contested land between the Kingdom of France and the Duchy of Normandy. He rode to war again, and he burned again. As he rode through a wrecked town, a weakened beam of wood in a house gave out and scared his horse, causing it to buck. The pommel of his saddle would stab him in the stomach. From there, he began to hemorrhage. He was taken to the priory of St. Gervais in Rouen. He would die there on September 9th, 1087. His two youngest sons were by his side. His eldest son Robert was in rebellion and at the court of the King of France at this point. His next eldest son, William, was left the Kingdom of England. His youngest son, Henry, was left a considerable amount of money. Both of William's younger sons left to secure their inheritance, likely on the advice of the Conqueror. After William's death, he would be buried at Caen beside his wife. William is a fascinating man. He has, to a great extent, shaped the view of England, France, and how these two countries would interact from 1066 till 1914. William is a hard man to judge. Many have asked if he was a good king or not. In support, he seems to have provided, on the whole, just and stable government. The counterpoint is that he was a hard man. As he aged, he became more brutal and cruel. Many of the rebellions later in his reign were brutally repressed. In the end, William was a hard man from a hard time. He was shaped by a lifetime of rebellion and betrayal. At the end of the day, William was not a man to be judged or shaped by history. He was one of the rare men who shape history. His victory at Hastings has, to a large extent, shaped the Western world. He will never have the title of great, or good, or kind, but he will forever be known as the Conqueror.